Welcome back to The Business Sense, the online show where we take complex things about business and we make them simple, so you can see what you're looking at and understand what you need to do next. Whether you're just getting started or you've been in it a while, but you know you need to take the next step, this is the show where we talk tactics and tools. We unlock business insights and we share some inspirational stories to help you make a success of your business. Today we're talking business mastery with our guest as we look at consumer engagement and 50 ways to innovate. With me in studio is professional speaker and business author who specializes in changing mindsets, building brands, and creating experts. We're chatting about consumer engagement and his latest book, Relentlessly Relevant, 50 Ways to Innovate. Douglas Kruger. Welcome, Douglas.
Pleasure to be here, Robin. Thanks.
So why this new book, Relentlessly Relevant?
Well, the reasoning behind it is I believe that there was kind of a meteorite strike in the South African business landscape a couple of years ago, and it's not one that anybody is talking about. And really what happened is a survey was done that pointed out that South Africans don't really care about emotional investment in a brand the way that we used to. We are not as brand loyal as we once were. We tend to respond much less to legacy these days and much more to how you're innovating into my life today. And it's an incredible opportunity for new and upcoming brands, if they're even aware of it, which most are not. And it's also a massive threat to the old dinosaurs who are playing on the idea of legacy. And you can tell which is which really just by listening to the kind of language they use. When they talk about our past, our history, how grand we are, that's a legacy brand. When they're referring to the customer, that's an innovation brand.
Now, I'm already thinking, which one am I? Our, theirs, past, our. What's so important about this idea? I heard you say innovating into my world. Why is this important to you?
Well, yes, because if we are playing on the idea of our legacy, so we're referencing what we've done in the past, we're essentially leaving consumers cold. And what that means is even the large brands could shed customers left, right, and center to the new and upcoming brands that are simply looking at their lives, their problems, their realities, and saying, what can we fix for you now? What are the realities of the life you're living and what can we do about that? Now, the interesting thing for us is a large brand can still be an innovator, but most large brands tend to play on the ego of the brand itself. So they are self-referential. It's all about how long they've been around, how tall their buildings are, and any other Freudian reference you care to think up. And it's less about the actual experience of the consumer.
Tell me a bit about the journey for choosing this topic. What's important about this for you, for Douglas? You're a speaker, you run a business, you're building a brand, you're doing very well at building your brand. Why is this important for you?
Well, I think the real problem that people struggle with whenever we hear the word innovation, we inherently think we should be doing it. Everyone talks about it, it's the latest buzzword, there's a lot of buy-in to it. But then the problem becomes, okay, go, innovate. What's your starting point? Where do you even begin? And I think most customers, or rather most companies, whether it's the large brands or even the sort of the smaller ones who tend to be a bit more agile, don't really know where to start. So my goal in writing this book was really to look for the levers behind innovation. Instead of saying, well, there's one grand academic theory, here's how to innovate. What I've said is there must be multiple ways. And I found 50. And it's a combination of my own and research on the topic, other books that I've read, the leading titles. And I've tried to condense it into sort of a Reader's Digest form of how, the principles of accessing innovation. Where are your starting points, in other words? So the basic concept behind this one, or the reason for it, is to take this ball of string and find the ends for you.
So when you say innovation, innovate, I've learned that word in the space of product development things in my business and stuff that we do. But that's not the conversation we're having. We're talking about the persona, the personality, the brand of a business or a product or a service.
In fact, I touch on everything. I touch on your internal culture, your product, what you're offering to the market, everything to do with innovation. And you know, we almost get too hung up on what the formal definition of innovation is. We're a species that comes up with stuff. That's what we do. And in fact, if you think about it, any other species on Earth, one of the primary differences between us and them is that we have a progressive storyline. We're different now to what we were 1,000 years ago. Take the most intelligent, I don't know, perhaps your dolphin. 1,000 years ago, they're living exactly as they do today. We have a progressive storyline. We come up with new stuff. We are thinkers. That's what innovation is. It's looking at what has come before and adding something on top of it. And there's a very fancy term for that, which you can use to pick up people if you want to. It's very sexy. It's called the ever-expanding adjacent possible. And basically the way that works is that ideas are like an inverse pyramid. The first person comes along, puts down a block, that's the first idea. The second person is then able to look at that idea, that block foundation, and see how two more blocks could exist on top of it. Now that wasn't possible before the first one was there. Third person comes along, sees the opportunity for three, and it's this ever-expanding adjacent possible. So we are a species with a narrative that keeps progressing, and it's because of that simple dynamic. Innovation is just adding ideas to what we know.
I heard you say increasing or progressive timeline, and what I'm hearing is that if my story isn't changing, now not just change for change's sake, but changing progressively and getting better or more value,
yes,
then I'm in trouble.
Well, you've touched on something very powerful there. In fact, two different things. The one is, as you say, don't just change for the sake of it. However, the great danger is that we tinker with what we have and get better and better at it while ignoring upcoming technologies, changes, and trends. The best known example is Kodak, looking at digital when they were so emotionally invested in film. And they looked at it in its inferior state and said, well, it's not a threat. It grew up in the background and it absolutely flattened them. It ran them over. Another way of looking at that is you might be the optimal manager of a chain of video rental stores and you can run them perfectly. But unless you're changing and innovating, you'll run that organization perfectly off a cliff when something like box office or Netflix comes along and makes your whole business model redundant. There is an expanding adjacent possible. New things are happening. So we can get better at what we do and still become redundant.
We're chatting with Douglas Kruger. We're talking about 50 ways to innovate and stay relentlessly relevant. Coming up in the next episode, we talk business mastery as we speak to another professional speaker and conference speaker about swift action mastery. We're in studio talking to Douglas Kruger about 50 ways to innovate and keeping relentlessly relevant. And what I heard you say just now is about that the progressive story, the change in my story as a brand, as a product or service, but the progressive change in my story to keep me relevant. Now that's big words. How do I do that? I'm just a regular guy. I'm in business like you, like any other guy I meet on the street. But how do I stay relevant?
Cool. Well, let's take the fear factor out of it. Whenever we think innovation, people tend to think huge amounts of money, or they think technology, or, and I think this is the most common one, they think developing an app. And there are thousands of ways of innovating, and they don't have to cost anything. They don't require huge amounts of resource. Here's a simple little trick. Ask yourself, what's awful about us? Now, of course, the human ego rebels against that. We want to know what's beautiful about our organization. We want the praise. But that's not where the pure gold lies in terms of finding opportunities to innovate. So take a very simple example. I was driving around Joburg the other day. An ad comes on the radio saying, don't you hate the fact that you have to pay for your plane ticket in full before you can apply for your visa to go overseas? And I mean, like myself, you travel a lot, and that one caught my attention. And it went on to say, at Virgin Airlines, we're the only airline that will fully refund your ticket if you don't get your visa. And I thought, that is brilliant. What they've done is they've said, what's awful about the entire travel experience? And here's a company that has technology, that has money, that has cabins that they can change, but they didn't. They went prior to actually meeting them in this entire experience and said, what's awful about it? And found a way to fix that. Now that doesn't require money and it doesn't require technology. It just requires being switched on and living through your customer's life. But that's maybe the key part of it, because as, for example, the manager of a chain of hotels, if you have that hat on when you walk into one of your rooms and inspect it, you might look around and say, well, beds are perfect, everything's been made, coffee's there, and think it's fine. However, if you spend a night in the room, you're going to notice that, well, you don't have a two-prong plug, and it's actually quite difficult to reach something over there, and so on and so forth. So it's the difference between looking at it as a manager versus living through it as a consumer. And that makes a huge difference to what we notice.
You just caught my attention there. Your book is entitled Relentlessly Relevant and not Relentlessly Famous. It's not about how good is my brand, but rather, and that's where we started, this consumer engagement. How do we get better at connecting with the people who's looking for what we have on offer so that they're willing buyers?
Yeah. And in fact, one of the interesting ones, a starting point in this book, is I spoke to the marketing manager of BMW SA, because they had a contradiction to this whole idea that people are not buying into legacy, they're buying innovation. They're about to turn 100. Their centenary is next year. And for all intents and purposes, that makes them a legacy brand. Yet they won coolest brand in South Africa last year. So I asked him, well, can you explain that contradiction? And he says, absolutely. He says, we do not speak of ourselves as a legacy brand. He says, even one of the clues is in the tagline, sheer driving pleasure. Implied in that is your sheer driving pleasure. They're not referencing a product or a thing or their history. They're referencing your emotion, your life, your feelings. And that little subtle change in mindset is really the heart and soul of it.
Now we're talking a big business there, an established brand and name that everybody knows. Even my kids know that name. But what about small business? What about a medium-sized business just getting started? We don't have all that asset or that collateral.
Yeah.
Are there different rules? Do the rules apply?
Well, if I were in that scenario, there are a couple of things that I would want to do. Firstly, when we start a business, because we're insecure in an industry, our hearts and souls are invested in trying to look like the big guys. We look at how the businesses are run in that industry, and we are desperate to fit in. And I'd say that's our first mistake. Our first goal should be to say, how can I look completely different to everyone else? And then the next question to ask yourself is, how do you make your business visceral? How do you bring in something emotion, something that has a bit of life to it? And it's astonishing how simply you can do this with even the most seemingly unimaginative, unemotional things. There's a chain store in America that replaces tires on cars. Now, if you had to think about that, I mean, what on earth could you possibly do to make that an emotional experience? Well, here's what they've done. Whenever you arrive at their front door, guaranteed someone will run up to your car. Now that may seem like a strange and a small thing, but it's made the world of difference to them. You don't have to walk in, find a counter, try and catch someone's eye. The second you arrive, someone will run up to your car. Now, of course, in South Africa, that's going to give us a fright and we'll hand over our keys immediately. But what they've done there is they found a way to add story, to add sparkle to something seemingly trivial.
So I'm just caught with that idea of somebody running up to my car. Douglas, what's another most innovative experience you've had in the past, let's say in our Southern African context, the brand that you've experienced? What did somebody do that caught your attention? Like, that's a really good...
Well, here's a strange one. And in fact, it's the opening story in my book. There's a guy, apparently, I haven't met him, but just outside of Soweto, there's a food vendor. And what he does is when you get to the front of the queue and you order your bunny chow, he'll either make it for you the conventional way, hand it over and you pay, or there's option B. You give him a little bit more money and he'll wrap it in cellophane, put it on the highway and let a truck run over it. Now, what then happens is your bunny chow does sort of a leapfrog down the highway. He runs out and retrieves it, and we talk about managing risk at work. And when you get it back, it's this mishmash of different colors and sort of shredded ingredients. And I don't know how this began. You have to assume it happened organically one day and someone said, that's pretty cool, I'll go with that. But think about that if you had to take it to its ultimate extreme. You have tourists going to places like Soweto, typically German, American, Japanese. If I were him, I would be in all the tour guide brochures, I would be on shows like Top Billing, advertising this unique, crazy, extreme South African experience. And it's simply the theatre of the thing that makes it stand out. He's selling bunny chow, for goodness sake, but he's doing it in such an unusual way with such an interesting story. I almost guarantee that if you are a German tourist and you go and experience that, it's the first story you're going to tell when you get home.
Fascinating. So here, what I'm hearing you say is one of the biggest steps we can do as we take those steps to get our business off the ground and we want to find our place in the market is actually to not find a place in the market.
That would be my starting point, yeah.
Be unique, just get it out there and do something no one else has ever done.
There's a speaker named Joe Calloway in the States who talks about becoming a category of one, and I love that. The idea that you can't be compared to anything else. And there are different ways of doing that. I mean, one example is take whatever it is you do, the heart and soul, the core proposition, take it to the nth degree. And a simple example of that one is Cirque du Soleil. They took the idea of a circus, which was really a dying industry, and they said, all right, how can we make this, take it out of the arena of kids' entertainment? How do we make this high-end, sophisticated, expensive, and a global art form? And it's been a runaway success story.
That's a really great picture to come to an end to wrap up on that. The Cirque du Soleil is a beautiful experience. It's an art form.
They change the tone of an industry.
Correct. And changing the rules and changing the game doesn't mean that you have to give up on what is art and what is beautiful about your product and your brand and your service.
Yes. In fact, very quickly, you can do the opposite as well. One of the most downloaded games in human history is Angry Birds. And it's the simplest thing you could possibly imagine.
We're chatting Business Mastery with Douglas Kruger and 50 ways to innovate so that you can remain relentlessly relevant to your customer. This is the Business Sense, the online show where we take complex business ideas and we make them simple so that you know what you need to do to take the next step. What idea, tactical tool that Douglas shared today will you apply as you take your business success story to the next level? On the next show, we talk with an international meta coach and we talk about personal branding and identifying how you can position yourself for success in your market. I'm Robin Pullen and this is The Business Sense.